"Leave him," the man sneered, the cold steel of his rifle pressing into Elara's ribs. Blood soaked through her heavy wool sweater, warm and terrifyingly fast. At her feet, a silver wolf cub whined, its hind leg caught in the rusted, unforgiving jaws of an illegal steel trap. I said, "Back away from the mutt, Elara." "He's just a baby," she gasped, her hands shaking as she clamped them around the trap's iron teeth. The freezing metal bit into her bare palms. "You've already killed his mother. And you're next if you don't let go." She didn't let go. With a guttural, agonizing cry, Elara ripped the trap open. The cub scrambled free just as the heavy walnut butt of the rifle struck her temple, sending her spiraling into total darkness. The forest of Blackwood Ridge was normally silent after a heavy snowfall, but tonight, the stillness was unnatural. It was a breathless, waiting kind of quiet. Kaelen ran through the chest-deep drifts, his boots barely making a sound. He didn't need to see the tracks to know he was too late. The scent of copper and gunpowder hung thick and heavy in the frigid air, burning the back of his throat. He was the Alpha of the Ridge, and someone had shed blood on his territory. Pack blood. Behind him, the heavy crunch of his second-in-command, Silas, broke the quiet. "Do you smell that?" Silas asked, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that vibrated with suppressed violence. "Gunpowder," Kaelen growled, coming to a sudden halt at the edge of a clearing. His amber eyes, usually masked by a facade of calm control, flared bright in the moonlight. "And silver." The clearing was a massacre painted in white and crimson. In the center lay the massive form of a female wolf, her silver coat matted with dark frozen blood. It was Tasha, one of their border sentries. Kaelen's jaw locked so tight his teeth ached. But it wasn't just Tasha's scent that had drawn him here. There was something else, a sweeter, utterly fragile scent. Human. He moved forward, his long coat sweeping the snow. 10 yards from Tasha's body, crumpled like a discarded doll at the base of a massive pine, lay a woman. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale cheek by a terrifying amount of blood weeping from a vicious gash on her temple. Her thick wool sweater was stained black at her side, where a bullet had grazed her ribs. But what stopped Kaelen dead in his tracks wasn't the extent of her injuries. It was what lay tucked beneath the protective curve of her arm. A silver cub, Tasha's pup. The tiny creature was shivering violently, a jagged cut running down its hind leg. But it was alive. As Kaelen approached, the cub let out a weak, desperate growl, pressing itself closer to the unconscious human woman as if to shield her. Silas stepped up beside Kaelen, letting out a sharp hiss. "A human! Here! She must be with the poachers!" "No," Kaelen said softly, his eyes dropping to the bloody steel trap discarded a few feet away. It was prized open. He looked at the woman's hands. Her palms were lacerated, the skin torn raw from gripping the rusted iron. "She didn't set the trap, Silas. She broke it." Kaelen dropped to his knees beside the woman. The cold radiating from her skin was alarming. Her pulse was an erratic flutter against her throat, fading fast. Up close, her scent hit him fully. Pine needles, sterile bandages, and an underlying current of sheer, stubborn adrenaline. There was no scent of malice, no stench of the poachers who had done this. "She's dying," Silas stating a cold fact. "We need to get the pup and go. The council's laws are clear, Kaelen. No humans in the compound. If she wakes up and sees—" "If we leave her here, she dies in 10 minutes, Kaelen interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute authority of the Alpha. He slipped his large, calloused hands beneath her shoulders and knees. She weighed practically nothing. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his chest. A strange, violent jolt of electricity snapped through him the moment her skin brushed his neck. His inner wolf, usually a roaring tempest of control and aggression, suddenly went deathly still, captivated by the rhythm of her failing heart. "Kaelen, you can't be serious." Silas stepped in his path. "You're risking the entire pack for a stray human." "She saved my bloodline," Kaelen snarled. his eyes flashing a dangerous, luminescent gold. He looked down at the pale, shattered woman in his arms. "And she is coming with us. Grab the cub. Move." Silas knew better than to argue with that tone. He scooped up the whimpering pup, tucking it inside his jacket. Kaelen didn't look back. He ran. He poured every ounce of his preternatural speed into navigating the treacherous terrain, holding her flush against his burning body heat. The wind whipped her dark hair across his face. "Hold on," he willed her silently, feeling the wet warmth of her blood soaking through his own shirt. "You fought a monster to save a wolf. Don't you dare surrender to the cold now." By the time the high wooden gates of the compound loomed through the blizzard, her breathing had shallowed into nothing more than mere whispers. Kaelen kicked the heavy oak doors open, roaring for the pack physician before he even crossed the threshold. The laws of his kind meant nothing tonight. He was going to save her, no matter the cost. Pain was not a single sensation. It was an orchestra. It started as a dull, throbbing drumbeat behind Elara's eyes, crescendoing into sharp, stabbing violins along her ribs, and finishing with a searing, brassy burn in the palms of her hands. She gasped, her eyelids flying open, expecting the biting wind of the forest and the cruel barrel of Vance's rifle. Instead, she saw a ceiling of polished dark cedar. Panic, sharp and metallic, spiked in her chest. She tried to sit up, but her body felt anchored to the mattress by an invisible weight. A soft, involuntary groan escaped her lips as her bandaged side pulled tight. "I wouldn't move if I were you." The voice came from the darkest corner of the room. It was deep, resonant, and coated in a velvet layer of warning. Elara's head snapped toward the sound, sending a fresh wave of nausea washing over her. A man stepped out of the shadows. Elara's breath hitched. He was, without question, the most imposing human being she had ever seen. He stood easily over 6'3", with broad shoulders that seemed to swallow the dim light of the bedside lamp. He wore a simple black Henley that stretched tight across his chest, and his dark hair was slightly longer on the top, falling into eyes that were an unnatural, piercing shade of amber. "Where am I?" Elara demanded, her voice a dry croak. She instinctively pulled the thick down comforter higher up her chest, hiding her bandaged ribs. "Where is the wolf? The baby?" The man walked slowly toward the foot of the bed. He moved with a terrifying grace, completely silent despite his size. "The cub is safe," he said quietly. "He's being treated for a lacerated tendon. He'll walk with a limp, but he'll live." Elara let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She fell back against the pillows, closing her eyes for a brief second. "Good. The man, the hunter, he had a gun." "I know." The man's voice tightened. "I saw the tracks, and I saw what you did to your hands to pry open a jaw trap meant to shatter bone." Elara opened her eyes, looking at her heavily bandaged hands resting on top of the blankets. The memory of the rusted iron tearing into her skin flashed in her mind. "I couldn't just let him die. He was crying. Most people would have run." The man tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Who are you?" "Elara," she said, her chin lifting defiantly. "Elara Vance. Now who are you and where am I?" A flicker of something dark passed through his eyes at her surname. "My name is Kaelen. You are on private property. A sanctuary of sorts. We found you bleeding out in the snow. You found me." Elara narrowed her eyes, ignoring the throbbing in her head. She was a wildlife rehabilitator who had retreated to a secluded cabin in the woods 3 years ago, running from a life in the city that had systematically tried to break her. She had learned to trust no one. "How did you find me? I was miles off any marked trail." "I know the woods," Kaelen replied smoothly, though the muscle in his jaw ticked. "Better than anyone." "I need to leave." Elara pushed the blankets aside, her bare legs swinging over the edge of the bed. The room spun wildly. She braced her wrapped hands on the mattress, gritting her teeth against the blinding pain. Before she could stand, Kaelen was there. He hadn't just walked across the room. He had practically teleported. His large hands gripped her shoulders, not hurting her, but locking her in place with the strength of iron vices. You lost 2 pints of blood, Elara. You have a severe concussion and 3 cracked ribs. If you try to walk out that door, you will collapse before you reach the bottom of the stairs. The heat radiating from his hands was staggering. It felt like standing too close to a roaring fire. Elara looked up, her face mere inches from his chest. She could hear his heart beating. It was slow, steady, and incredibly powerful. She looked into his amber eyes and felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with her head injury. "I don't know you," she whispered, her defiance faltering slightly against his overwhelming presence. "I don't belong here." "You saved one of mine," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "That makes you my responsibility. You aren't leaving until you're healed. That is not a request." He let go of her shoulders and stepped back, leaving her suddenly cold. He turned toward the heavy wooden door. "There is water on the nightstand. Rest. Someone will bring you food shortly." "Wait," Elara called out as his hand gripped the brass doorknob. He paused, not looking back. "The man who shot me, he wasn't right." Kaelen froze. "What do you mean?" Elara swallowed hard, remembering the sheer terror of the encounter. "When he hit me, he smiled, and in the moonlight, his eyes, they weren't human. They were yellow, like a sick, pale yellow." The silence in the room became absolute. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kaelen finally turned his head, his profile carved in harsh, unforgiving lines. "Get some sleep, Elara," he said softly, the underlying danger in his tone unmistakable. "You're safe here." He stepped out and closed the door with a quiet click, leaving Elara alone with a rising sense of dread that she had just traded one nightmare for an entirely different kind of danger. The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut behind Kaelen when the arguments began. Elara strained her ears, pressing herself against the pillows. The walls of the room were thick, likely stone and heavy timber, but the voices carrying from the hallway were loud, angry, and distinctly inhuman in their resonance. "You brought a human into the sanctum, Kaelen. Are you out of your mind?" A woman's voice hissed. It was a sharp, aristocratic tone, dripping with condescension. "The laws are absolute. The laws dictate we protect those who protect the pack, Lyra." Kaelen's voice rumbled, low and dangerous. "She is a human, a liability. If the council finds out—" "I am the alpha of this territory," Kaelen interrupted, the sheer force of his voice vibrating through the floorboards beneath Elara's bed. "Not the council. She saved Fen. Tasha is dead. This human is the only reason my sister's pup is breathing. She stays." "For how long?" Lyra demanded. "Until she starts asking questions. Until she notices we don't eat, heal, or move like the weak creatures she's used to. She smells of fear, Kaelen. And she smells of him." Silence stretched in the hallway. Elara's breath caught in her throat. "Him. Who are they talking about?" "She said the poacher had yellow eyes," Kaelen finally said, his voice stripped of all emotion, a sharp intake of breath from Lyra. "Vance!" "Yes. He's crossing into our borders again. He's mocking you." "He's hunting," Kaelen corrected softly. "And he left a witness. He didn't kill her because he wanted her to suffer, or he wanted me to find her. Either way, he will come back for her to finish the job." Elara pressed her bandaged hands over her mouth to stifle a gasp. The man in the woods, the one who had laughed as he broke her ribs, his name was Vance, but that was her ex-husband's name. A man she had faked her own death to escape 3 years ago. It couldn't be a coincidence. But the man in the woods hadn't looked like her ex-husband. He had been massive, scarred, and his eyes, panic flared, hot and suffocating. She threw the heavy blankets off again, ignoring the screaming agony in her side. She had to get out. If these people, these whatever they were, knew Vance, and if Vance was coming here, she was trapped in a cage. She swung her legs over and forced herself to stand. The room tilted violently. She grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany nightstand, her knuckles turning white beneath the gauze. She took one step, two. The door handle turned. Elara lunged for the heavy brass lamp on the nightstand, gripping it by the neck like a club. She spun around, raising it over her head, her chest heaving. The door swung open. It wasn't Kaelen, and it wasn't the woman named Lyra. Standing in the doorway was a young man, perhaps 19, with a mop of unruly silver blonde hair and a tray of food in his hands. But what stopped Elara was the creature limping beside him, the silver cub. Its hind leg was heavily wrapped in a thick splint, and it looked exhausted. But the moment it saw Elara, its ears perked up. It let out a soft, high-pitched chirp, a sound of absolute recognition. Elara slowly lowered the lamp. The cub limped forward, ignoring the young man's soft curse of, "Hey Fen, easy," and pushed its wet nose against Elara's bare knee. Elara dropped to the floor, biting back a cry of pain as her knees hit the hardwood. She gently brought her bandaged hands up to cradle the cub's head. The wolf pressed into her touch, letting out a deep, rumbling sigh that sounded entirely too human. "He wouldn't eat," the young man said quietly from the doorway, his eyes wide as he watched them. "He just kept pacing and crying. Alpha Kaelen said to bring him to you." "Hey there, little one," Elara whispered, a tear escaping and tracking through the dried blood on her cheek. "You're safe." "You shouldn't be out of bed," a dark voice commanded from the hallway. Kaelen appeared behind the young man, his broad frame blocking out the light from the corridor. He looked down at Elara on the floor, the heavy brass lamp still clutched in one hand, the wolf pup resting its head in her lap. His amber eyes flicked from the weapon to her face, reading the sheer terror she was desperately trying to hide. "I need to leave," Elara said, looking up at him, refusing to break eye contact. "You know the man who attacked me. You know Vance. If he's coming here, I won't let you or your people get hurt because of me." Kaelen stepped into the room, waving the young man away and shutting the door behind him. The lock clicked into place. The finality of the sound made Elara's heart hammer against her bruised ribs. He walked slowly toward her, his expression unreadable. He knelt down gracefully, bringing himself to her eye level. The cub, Fen, abandoned Elara's lap and hobbled over to Kaelen, pressing its nose against his chest. Kaelen absent-mindedly stroked the pup's ears, but his burning amber gaze never left Elara's face. "You misunderstand the situation, Elara," Kaelen said, his voice a low, gravelly purr that vibrated in the tight space between them. "Vance is a rogue, a killer who has terrorized these woods for years. But he is not just a man." "I know," she whispered, her hands shaking. "His eyes." "He is a shifter," Kaelen said bluntly, stripping away the illusion of the normal world. "Like me, like the pup in your lap." Elara stopped breathing. She looked down at the silver cub, then back up to the towering man before her. "And if he marked you as his prey," Kaelen continued, leaning in just a fraction closer, the scent of pine and danger rolling off him in waves, "then there is nowhere on this earth you can run where he won't find you. Your only chance of survival is staying exactly where you are. With me." The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "Shifter." Elara stared at the man kneeling before her. She expected to see a flicker of madness in his amber eyes, a crack in the facade that would prove this was a fever dream brought on by blood loss and a severe concussion. But Kaelen's gaze was devastatingly steady. "You're insane," she breathed, though her voice lacked conviction. She looked down. The silver cub, Fen, was gnawing gently on the edge of Kaelen's black Henley, his tail giving a soft, rhythmic thump against the hardwood floor. Wolves didn't act like this. They didn't have splints perfectly wrapped around their hind legs, and men didn't radiate heat like a furnace, nor did they move with the silent, terrifying grace Kaelen possessed. "I wish I were," Kaelen replied softly. He didn't move to comfort her. He stayed exactly where he was, giving her space, though every muscle in his broad shoulders was coiled tight. It would make explaining the impossible much easier. "But you know what you saw in the woods, Elara. You felt his strength when he struck you. You saw his eyes." Elara swallowed hard. the memory of Vance's mocking laugh echoing in her skull. She closed her eyes, and suddenly, 3 years of carefully buried memories clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The way Vance used to disappear for days, returning with torn clothes and a scent of copper and earth. The way his bruises from bar fights healed overnight. The unnatural, bone-crushing strength in his grip when he was angry. "He was my husband." The words tumbled from her lips before she could stop them, a fragile, broken whisper in the quiet room. Kaelen went absolutely still. The ambient sound of his breathing stopped. Even Fen paused his chewing, looking up at the sudden, suffocating tension that flooded the space. "Explain," Kaelen commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the sharp, vibrating order of an alpha. Elara's eyes snapped open, a defensive spark igniting in her chest. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her bandaged hands around her shins. "Don't use that tone with me. I'm not one of your... whatever you are. 3 years ago, I was married to an investment banker named Vance. Or so I thought. He was abusive, controlling. One night he pushed me too far and I ran. I drove my car off an embankment, managed to jump clear before it hit the river, and let the police think I washed away in the current. I changed my name. I hid in these woods." She looked away, staring at the frost creeping along the window panes. "I thought he was just a monster in a tailored suit." I didn't know he was an actual monster. A low, guttural growl vibrated in Kaelen's chest. It was a terrifying sound, primal and entirely devoid of human restraint. Elara flinched, pressing back against the nightstand. Instantly, Kaelen reined it in. The gold in his eyes receded, leaving behind a dark, tempestuous brown. He reached out, his movements incredibly slow, and lightly touched the edge of her casted knee. The heat of his fingertips penetrated the thick wool of her sweatpants. "He didn't stumble upon you by accident," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a harsh rasp. "Vance is a rogue. He was cast out of a northern pack for butchering his own kind. He's been circling my territory for 6 months, probing our weaknesses. But tonight he wasn't hunting my borders. He was hunting you." Elara's breath hitched. "He knows I'm alive." "He knows," Kaelen confirmed grimly. "He caught your scent. And he left you alive in my woods, not just to torture you, but to send me a message. He wanted me to find his leftovers." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She was a pawn, a piece of bait in a territorial war between monsters. The sickening realization made her stomach heave. She clamped a hand over her mouth, turning away. "Hey, look at me." Kaelen's voice was suddenly right beside her ear. He had crossed the remaining distance in a fraction of a second. His large hands gently cupped her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. His thumbs brushed just below her cheekbones, avoiding the nasty cut on her temple. "Listen to me, Elara. He is not a man in a suit anymore. And you are not a helpless wife. You pried a bear trap open with your bare hands to save a creature you didn't even know. You are a survivor." His thumbs stroked her skin, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her racing heart. The physical proximity was overwhelming, the scent of pine, winter air, and pure, concentrated power. "I protect what is in my territory," Kaelen murmured, his gaze dropping momentarily to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "Vance made a fatal error tonight. He thought leaving you here would make you a victim. Instead, he just made you my pack." Elara lasted exactly 2 days in the bedroom before the confinement became unbearable. Her ribs screamed in protest with every breath, and her hands throbbed beneath the fresh gauze, but the suffocating feeling of being caged was worse. She was a woman who lived by her own rules in the wild. 4 walls, no matter how luxurious, felt like a prison. Dressed in an oversized gray sweater and soft leggings someone had left folded on the dresser, she slowly navigated the heavy oak staircase. The compound was vast, an architectural marvel of exposed timber, dark stone, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the snow-drowned valley of Blackwood Ridge. She followed the sound of low, murmuring voices and the scent of roasting meat. The grand kitchen was the size of a commercial restaurant, outfitted in sleek black marble and stainless steel. The moment Elara crossed the threshold, the conversation died. 4 people stood around the massive island. Silas, the imposing second-in-command she vaguely remembered from the woods, leaned against the counter. Beside him stood a strikingly beautiful woman with sharp cheekbones and icy blue eyes. Lyra, the woman who had argued against saving her. The other 2 were younger men, built like linebackers, who simply stared at her with open suspicion. "Well?" Lyra purred, breaking the heavy silence. She set down a mug of coffee, her movements fluid and predatory. "The stray is out of bed. I suppose congratulations are in order for surviving the night." Elara didn't flinch. She had spent 3 years rehabilitating wounded hawks, foxes, and bobcats. She knew how to handle a predator sizing her up. "You never broke eye contact, and you never backed down." "Thank you," Elara said, her voice steady despite the searing pain in her side. "I was looking for some water. And Finn." "The cub is in the medical wing," Silas rumbled, crossing his arms. His gaze was heavy, calculating. "You shouldn't be wandering, human. The Alpha gave strict orders for you to rest." "With all due respect, Silas, I know my own limits," Elara replied, limping slowly toward the refrigerator. Lyra stepped into her path, blocking the way. Up close, the woman was intimidatingly tall, and the hostility rolling off her was a physical weight in the air. "You don't know anything about limits," Lyra said, her voice a soft, venomous hiss. "You don't belong here. Kaelen's misplaced hero complex might have bought you a bed, but don't mistake that for acceptance. Because of you, a rogue killer knows exactly where our soft underbelly is. You are a liability, Lyra," Silas warned quietly, but he didn't move to stop her. Elara looked up into Lyra's icy eyes. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs, but a familiar, stubborn anger ignited in her gut. She had let one person intimidate her into submission in her life. She would die before she let it happen again. If you think I'm the soft underbelly," Elara said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave, "you're severely mistaken. Vance is a coward who preys on the weak. I survived him when I was young, foolish, and human, and I will survive him now. But if my presence here is such a threat to your supposedly powerful pack, then open the front door and let me walk out." Lyra's eyes flashed a dangerous lupine gold. She took half a step forward, her lips parting to reveal teeth that seemed just a fraction too sharp. "Enough." The single word cracked like a whip across the room. Kaelen stood in the archway of the kitchen. He was dressed in dark denim and a heavy flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded silvery scars. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of his presence instantly suffocated the tension in the room. Lyra immediately took a step back, lowering her chin in a reluctant show of submission. Kaelen didn't look at his pack. His amber eyes were fixed entirely on Elara. He took in her rigid posture, her pale face, and the defiant tilt of her chin. A muscle feathered in his jaw, and for a fleeting second, Elara thought she saw a flash of profound, fierce pride in his gaze. He walked slowly toward her, parting the room like the Red Sea. He stopped inches from her, reaching around her frozen form to open the refrigerator. He pulled out a bottle of water, unscrewed the cap, and pressed it gently into her bandaged hands. "Drink," he commanded softly, the harshness of the Alpha melting into something dangerously intimate. He turned his head just slightly, addressing the room without looking at them. "Elara is under my personal protection. Anyone who questions her place in this house answers to me. Are we clear?" "Crystal, Kaelen," Lyra muttered, turning on her heel and storming out of the kitchen, Silas close behind her. When they were alone, Kaelen looked back down at Elara. The ghost of a smirk played on his lips. "You handle yourself well for a human surrounded by wolves." Elara took a shaky sip of the water, the adrenaline slowly leaving her system, leaving her trembling. "I told you, I'm used to dealing with animals." Kaelen chuckled, a low, rich sound that made Elara's breath catch. But the amusement faded quickly from his eyes, replaced by a dark, looming storm. You're going to need that fire, Elara, because Vance just made his next move. The air in Kaelen's private study was thick with tension. Maps of Blackwood Ridge were spread across a massive mahogany desk, dotted with red and black markers. 10 minutes ago, Kaelen said, his voice flat and tactical. He leaned over the desk, bracing his weight on his knuckles. The Southern Border Patrol picked up his scent. He didn't cross the line. He just walked the perimeter, pacing. Elara sat heavily in a leather armchair by the roaring fireplace, her hands tightly gripping the armrests. He's testing your defenses, seeing how long it takes for your patrols to respond. Kaelen looked up at her, surprise momentarily masking the grim set of his features. Yes, exactly. Most humans wouldn't deduce that. I told you, I know how he thinks, Elara said, staring into the flames. He's a predator who likes to play with his food. He won't just attack in a blind rage. He'll look for the weakest point, exploit it, and make sure you know he outsmarted you before he strikes. A sharp knock on the heavy oak door interrupted them. Silas entered, his broad shoulders covered in a dusting of fresh snow. He looked grim. In his massive, calloused hand, he held a small plastic evidence bag. We found this exactly where his scent track ended, Kaelen, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Hanging from a branch of the old weeping willow at the creek crossing. He wanted us to find it. He tossed the bag onto the desk. Kaelen picked it up. Inside was a piece of jewelry, a delicate silver chain with a teardrop pendant, the metal slightly blackened and warped at the edges, as if it had survived a terrible heat. Elara stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. She pushed herself out of the chair, ignoring the sharp stab in her ribs, and walked toward the desk like a woman in a trance. Let me see that, she whispered. Kaelen's eyes locked onto her pale face. He slowly handed her the bag. Elara's trembling fingers traced the outline of the teardrop through the plastic. It was unmistakable. It was the necklace Vance had given her on their first anniversary. She had been wearing it the night she drove her car off the embankment. It had been lost in the wreckage when the vehicle burst into flames. "It's mine," she choked out, dropping the bag onto the desk as if it had burned her. "It was in the car when it burned. He went back for it. He dug it out of the ashes." Silas swore softly under his breath, turning his face away. Kaelen stared at the blackened silver, his jaw locking so tight it looked carved from granite. The scent of Elara's sheer, unadulterated terror filled the room, acidic and sharp. But beneath it, Kaelen smelled something else, the metallic tang of the silver and the stale, rotten pine scent of the rogue who had touched it. "He's not just pacing the borders, Silas," Kaelen said, his voice deadly quiet. "This isn't a scouting mission." "Then what is it?" Silas demanded. "Psychological warfare," Elara answered for him, wrapping her arms around her waist, feeling violently sick. "He's telling me that he knows the truth. He knows I faked my death. He knows exactly where I am. And he's telling you that your borders mean nothing to him." Kaelen stepped around the desk. He didn't hesitate this time. He closed the distance between them and pulled Elara firmly against his chest. She didn't fight him. She buried her face in his flannel shirt, her hands gripping the fabric as a tremor racked her body. His arms wrapped around her, a solid, impenetrable fortress of heat and muscle. "Silas," Kaelen growled over her head, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, ancient power that made the windows rattle in their frames. "Double the guard on the southern perimeter. Pull the pups and the elders into the underground sanctum. No one hunts alone. Alpha, if he wants her—" Silas started, a note of desperation in his tone. "If he wants her, he will have to pry her out of my cold, dead hands." Kaelen snarled, his amber eyes flashing with lethal promise. He pressed his lips to the crown of Elara's hair, holding her tighter. "Let him come. I'll bury him in the snow." The blizzard outside had escalated into a howling, white-out tempest, hammering against the reinforced glass of Kaelen's study. Inside, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, angry embers. Elara sat on the edge of the leather sofa, her eyes fixed on the heavy silver hunting knife Kaelen had just placed in her hands. The metal was cold, the hilt wrapped in dark, worn leather that perfectly fit her grip. Silver, Kaelen said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her anxiety. He knelt before her, his large hands resting lightly over her bandaged ones. It burns us. It disrupts the healing process. If he gets close, you don't warn him. You don't hesitate. You aim for the neck or the chest. I've never stabbed anyone, Elara whispered, the weight of the weapon pulling her hands down. You're not stabbing anyone tonight, Kaelen promised, his amber eyes burning with a fierce, possessive light. I won't let him within 100 yards of you. The knife is just a contingency. It's control, Elara. When a monster makes you feel powerless, you put a blade in your hand. A sudden, violent tremor shook the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep concussive thud that resonated from the eastern wing of the compound, followed instantly by the sharp, terrifying sound of tearing metal. Kaelen was on his feet in a microsecond, the warmth leaving Elara's hands. A guttural roar echoed through the hallway. Silas's voice commanding the guard. He hit the eastern gate, Kaelen growled, his jaw tight. He brought the rest of his rogue pack. Elara stood up, her ribs screaming in protest. He wouldn't lead a frontal assault. You said it yourself. He's a coward who exploits weaknesses. A frontal attack is suicide against your numbers. Kaelen froze, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. The logic clicked into place just as the heavy oak door of the study burst open. One of the younger guards stood there, bleeding from a gash above his eye. Alpha, the guard gasped. The eastern gate is breached, but it's a distraction. There are only 3 rogues there. Silas is holding them, but... Before the guard could finish his sentence, every light in the compound snapped off. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, and heavy. The hum of the generator deep in the basement sputtered and died. Silence crashed over the estate, broken only by the shrieking wind outside. The power, Elara breathed, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. He's inside, Kaelen said, the words slipping into a terrifying, inhuman vibration. The scent hit him then, the foul, stale stench of rotting pine and dried blood. It wasn't coming from the east. It was coming from below them. The sub-basement, he used the drainage tunnels. Another sound pierced the darkness, a high-pitched, desperate yelp echoing up from the medical wing on the first floor. Fen, Elara's blood ran ice-cold. The cub! He's down there! Elara, stay here. Lock the door, Kaelen ordered, his eyes glowing a faint predatory gold in the pitch black. But as he turned to the guard to issue orders, Elara gripped the silver knife tighter. She was done waiting in the dark. She was done letting Vance take the things she cared about. The corridors of the compound were a labyrinth of shadows. Elara moved with agonizing slowness, pressing her back against the cold stone wall, the silver knife held out in front of her. Kaelen had vanished into the darkness ahead, moving too fast for human eyes to track, but the sheer size of the estate meant they were separated in the chaos. She followed the whimpering. It was faint, choked off, coming from the double doors of the medical wing at the end of the hall. Elara pushed the door open. The emergency moonlight filtering through the skylight painted the room in pale, ghostly strokes. Overturned trays and scattered bandages littered the floor. In the corner, huddled beneath a metal examination table, was Fen. The silver cub was shaking violently, his teeth bared in a silent, terrified snarl, staring at the center of the room. Hello, Elara. The voice slid out of the shadows, smooth as silk and dripping with arsenic. Elara stopped dead. The air in her lungs evaporated. From the darkness beside the medicine cabinets stepped a man. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath a torn, dark coat. His face was ruggedly handsome, the jawline sharp, but the illusion of humanity was shattered by his eyes. They were a sick, luminous yellow, the pupils blown wide and feral. Vance, you look well, Vance purred, tilting his head. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The floorboards groaned under his unnatural weight. A bit battered, perhaps. I must admit, when I smelled your blood in the snow, I almost didn't believe it. My fragile little wife, surviving a burning car and living like a rat in the woods. Elara's hands shook, but she didn't step back. She planted her feet, raising the silver blade. "I'm not your wife. I haven't been for 3 years." Vance laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the tile walls. "A piece of paper doesn't break a bond, Elara. You belong to me. You always have. Did you really think you could hide in another Alpha's territory? Kaelen thinks he can protect you, but he's out there tearing my decoys apart, and you are in here, alone." "I'm not alone," Elara said, her voice dropping into a deadly calm that surprised even herself. "Oh?" Vance mocked, his yellow eyes flashing to the cowering wolf cub. "You mean the mutt? I'll snap its neck right after I break your legs so you can never run from me again." He lunged. He didn't move like a man. He moved like a blur of sheer violence. But Elara wasn't the terrified woman from 3 years ago. She didn't cower. She didn't freeze. She remembered Kaelen's words. "Don't hesitate." As Vance's massive hand reached for her throat, Elara ducked under his sweeping arm, driving her weight forward and thrust the silver knife upward. The blade sank deep into the meat of Vance's thigh. A roar of pure, agonizing fury erupted from Vance's chest. The sound was deafening, half man, half beast. He backhanded her. The blow caught Elara on the shoulder, sending her flying backward. She crashed into a glass cabinet, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The air knocked from her lungs as her cracked ribs screamed in agony. Vance ripped the silver knife from his leg, his flesh sizzling and smoking where the metal touched him. His face contorted, the bones shifting and popping sickeningly beneath his skin as he lost control of his human form, his jaw elongating into a monstrous snout. "I'm going to rip you apart," he snarled, limping toward her, his claws extending from his fingertips. Before he could take another step, the heavy oak doors of the medical wing were blown completely off their hinges. The doors shattered inward, showering the room with splinters. Through the settling dust stepped Kaelen. He didn't look human. His eyes were a blazing, blinding gold. His fangs were fully descended, and the muscles in his arms and chest bulged against his torn flannel shirt. The sheer suffocating pressure of his aura filled the room, heavy enough to bring a lesser creature to its knees. Vance spun around, his yellow eyes widening in sudden, raw panic. He had miscalculated Kaelen's speed. "You're dead, rogue." Kaelen's voice wasn't spoken. It was a physical vibration that rattled the medical instruments on the counters. Vance roared, throwing himself at Kaelen. The impact sounded like 2 freight trains colliding. The floor buckled beneath them. Kaelen caught Vance by the throat, his momentum driving the rogue backward into the solid stone wall. The wall cracked. Vance slashed wildly, his claws tearing 4 deep, bloody gashes across Kaelen's chest. Kaelen didn't even flinch. The Alpha's strength was overwhelming, fueled by a wrath so ancient and deep it defied reason. Elara dragged herself up from the broken glass, her breathing ragged. She watched the brutal primal war unfolding in front of her. Vance was fighting dirty, using his heavier mass to try and pin Kaelen, but Kaelen was lethal precision. Vance, realizing he was outmatched, made a desperate, cowardly play. He kicked Kaelen in the center of his chest, breaking the Alpha's grip just enough to twist away. But Vance didn't run for the door. He lunged toward the corner, diving straight for the whimpering silver cub. "No!" Elara screamed. She didn't think. She grabbed a heavy steel oxygen tank from the wreckage of the cabinet beside her. With a surge of adrenaline that blinded her to her own pain, she swung it with everything she had. The steel cylinder collided squarely with the side of Vance's knee with a sickening crack. Vance howled, his leg buckling beneath him, collapsing mere inches from Fen. That second of distraction was all Kaelen needed. The Alpha descended on him like a shadow of death. Kaelen's hands locked around Vance's neck and jaw. With a savage, merciless twist, a sharp, horrific snap echoed through the silent room. Vance's body went completely limp, collapsing onto the tiles. He didn't move again. Silence, heavy and ringing, descended upon the medical wing. Kaelen stood over the body, his chest heaving, blood dripping from the deep lacerations on his torso. Slowly, the golden fire faded from his eyes, replaced by a deep, grounding brown. He turned, Elara stood among the glass, clutching the heavy oxygen tank, trembling violently as the adrenaline began to crash. Kaelen crossed the room, stepping over the wreckage. He gently took the tank from her hands, discarding it. Then, he pulled her into his arms. Elara buried her face in his uninjured shoulder, a sob finally breaking loose from her throat. "It's over," Kaelen whispered fiercely, resting his cheek against the top of her head, his massive arms wrapping around her like an impenetrable shield. "He's gone, Elara. You're safe. You're mine to protect now. Always." Down by their feet, the silver cub limped out from under the table. Fen nudged his wet nose against Elara's ankle, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Spring arrived in Blackwood Ridge, melting the heavy snow into rushing silver rivers. Elara stood on the grand wraparound porch of the compound, the warm breeze tugging at her dark hair. Her ribs were healed, leaving only faint scars, and her hands were steady as she tossed a tennis ball into the grass. Fen, now a gangly, half-grown adolescent wolf with only a slight limp, bounded happily after it. Large, warm arms wrapped around Elara from behind, pulling her flush against a solid chest. Kaelen rested his chin on her shoulder, pressing a soft kiss to her neck. The bond between them was no longer a frantic spark of survival. It was a deep, burning ember that warmed her to her very soul. She had come to the woods to hide, but she had finally found her home. "Ready for the border patrol, Luna?" Kaelen murmured, his amber eyes smiling. Elara leaned back against him, perfectly at peace. "Always. If you enjoyed Elara and Kaelen's heart-pounding journey of survival and romance, please like, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more stories from the Blackwood Ridge Pack.